Hello viewers, welcome to the section Extending Microservices. In this section we will learn about exception handling, HATOS, the REST application architecture, validation, documenting REST services, and caching. Now we move on to the video exception handling. In this video we will customize the exception and return the proper response status with a customized message. Exception handling is one of the important parts of developing web services. When something goes wrong, we would want to return a good description of what went wrong to the service consumer. Spring Boot provides good default exception handling. We will start with looking at the default exception handling features provided by Spring Boot before moving on to customizing them. To understand the default exception handling provided by Spring Boot, let's start with firing a request to a non-existent URL. First, we need to start the server. Import the existing Maven projects into our Eclipse IDE. Next, choose the path of our code bundle. Run the application.java from the service folder. Go to the console tab and you can see the server has started. Now open the Postman to send a GET request to the localhost 8080 non-existing resource, using a header with the key as content type and the value as application JSON. After sending the GET request, you can see the response which is highlighted. Some important things to note from this response. The response header has an HTTP status of 404 resource not found message. Secondly, Spring Boot returns a valid JSON message as a response to the message stating that the resource is not found. Go back to our Eclipse IDE. Let's create a resource that throws an exception and send a GET request to it in order to understand how the application reacts to runtime exceptions. We can go to Controller folder to open the todocontroller.java. In this todocontroller.java, we have created a dummy service that throws an exception which is highlighted. Before going further, we need to know some important things. First, we have created a GET service with the URI user's dummy service. The service throws runtime exception. We chose runtime exception to be able to create the exception easily. We can easily replace it with a custom exception if needed. Now in Postman we will send a GET request to the localhost 8080 user's dummy service. The response is highlighted. The response header has an HTTP status of 500 internal server error. Spring Boot also returns the message with which the exception is thrown. As we have seen in the previous two examples, Spring Boot provides good default exception handling. Next, we will focus on understanding how the application reacts to custom exceptions. Go back to our Eclipse IDE to create a custom exception and throw it from a service. Click on the toDoNotFoundException.java from the Bean folder. It's a very simple piece of code that defines toDoNotFoundException. By using this getMapping annotation block of code, we have enhanced our toDoController class to throw toDoNotFoundException when a todo with a given ID is not found. If toDoService returns a null todo, we throw toDoNotFoundException. Now go to Postman. When we execute the service with a GET request to a non-existent todo with the localhost 8080, we get the response which is highlighted. As we can see, exception response is sent back to the service consumer. However, there is one thing that can be improved further: the response status. When a resource is not found, it is recommended that you return a 404 resource not found status. We will look at how to customize the response status in the next example. Open our Eclipse IDE. Let's look at how to customize the previous exception and return the proper response status with a customized message. We have created a bean to define the structure of our custom exception message, named as exceptionresponse.java from the service folder. We have created a simple exception response bean with an auto-populated timestamp with a few additional properties, namely message and details. When toDoNotFoundException is thrown, we would want to return a response using the exception response bean. The highlighted block of code shows how we can create a global exception handling for toDoNotFoundException.class. In this REST response entity exception handler line, we are extending response entity exception handler, which is the base class provided by Spring MVC for centralized exception handling controller advice classes. Exception handler annotation defines that the method to follow will handle the specific exception to do not found exception.class. Any other exceptions for which custom exception handling is not defined will follow the default exception handling provided by Spring Boot. These highlighted lines of code create a custom exception response. New response entity is the definition to return a 404 resource not found response with a custom exception defined. When we execute the service in Postman with a GET request to a non-existent to-do with a local host 8080, we get the response which is highlighted. Next, go back to our Eclipse IDE. If you want to create a generic exception message for all exceptions, we can add a method to the REST response entity exception handler with the exception handler annotation. In this video, we learned about exception handling,